Welcome to Deep Dive Devotions, where each day we slow down and dig into one chapter of the Bible, exploring its meaning, its context, and what it shows us about God and His work in our lives. Today's reading is from Genesis chapter 14. We're going to take a deep dive into a really fascinating and somewhat unexpected moment in Abram's life, long before he was renamed Abraham. Up until this point, we've mostly seen him as a wandering shepherd, a family man dealing with domestic issues, or a traveler building altars. But here, the camera lens widens dramatically, and we see Abram in a completely different light, as a formidable warrior, a strategic military commander, and a man of immense active faith. This chapter stands out because it feels a bit like a sudden shift in genre. We go from intimate family narratives and travel logs to an intense, high-stakes war chronicle involving international politics and military strategy. It answers a crucial question: can the promise of God survive in a world tearing itself apart by war? Right in the middle of all this chaos and violence, we get a beautiful picture of God's protection and a mysterious encounter that points us straight to the future priesthood of Jesus. To really understand the gravity of what's happening in the first 11 verses, you have to picture the complex political map of that time. It's essentially a world war occurring in the microcosm of the Dead Sea region. The text opens by listing a formidable group of 4 kings from the east, places like Shinar, which is Babylon, and Elam, which is Persia. These weren't just local chieftains, they were the superpowers of the ancient Near East, led by a powerhouse named Chedorlaomer. Opposing them are 5 kings from the cities of the plain, the most famous being the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. The backstory here is classic imperial politics. For 12 years, these 5 local kings had been under the heavy thumb of Chedorlaomer, paying him tribute, taxing their people to fill his coffers, and bowing to his authority. But in the 13th year, they reached a breaking point. They decided they had had enough and rebelled, essentially declaring independence and refusing to pay. They probably thought the distance was too great for Chedorlaomer to bother returning. They were wrong. Naturally, a king like Chedorlaomer wasn't going to let that slide. It would make him look weak to his other subjects. So, in the 14th year, he rallies his allies and goes on a brutal, calculated campaign to re-establish dominance. The Bible details their warpath, and it reveals a terrifying strategy. They didn't just march straight to Sodom to punish the rebels immediately. Instead, they swept down the King's Highway on the east side of the Jordan, systematically dismantling all the neighboring tribes first. They defeated giants like the Rephaim, the Zuzim, and the Emim, ancient peoples known for their size and strength. This serves 2 purposes in the narrative. First, it secures their flank, so no one can attack them from behind. And second, it shows us just how unstoppable this Eastern coalition was. If they could crush the fearsome giants that everyone else was afraid of, what chance did a few city kings from the valley have? They were sweeping through the land like a wildfire, crushing anyone who stood in their way, which makes what happens later with Abram even more miraculous. The conflict finally comes to a head in the Valley of Siddim, near the Dead Sea. The text adds a gritty detail here. The valley was full of bitumen pits, basically open tar pits used for mortar and waterproofing. The 5 rebel kings line up in battle formation against the 4 imperial kings. You would think the locals would have the advantage. They know the terrain, and they have the home field advantage with the tar pits acting as natural traps for the invaders. But despite this, the rebels get absolutely demolished. The text paints a chaotic scene where the strategy backfires completely. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, rather than trapping the enemy, end up fleeing and falling into these very tar pits themselves, while the survivors scatter and run for the hills. It's a total rout. The Eastern Coalition sacks the cities, stripping them bare. They take all the food, all the goods, the livestock, and the people. And here is the tragic hook that pulls Abram into the fray. Among the captives, they take Lot, Abram's nephew, who was living in Sodom, along with all his possessions. It's a stark, painful reminder of the danger Lot put himself in by choosing to pitch his tent toward and eventually live inside a wicked city. He sought comfort and civilization, but found himself a prisoner of war. The victors turn north to head home, heavily laden with spoils, thinking the war is over and they've won. Then the perspective shifts in verse 13, zooming in on a lone figure, a survivor. One who escaped runs to tell Abram the Hebrew. This is actually the first time the word Hebrew is used in the Bible. It likely comes from a root word meaning to cross over, identifying Abram as the one who crossed over the river Euphrates, the stranger and sojourner. Abram is living peacefully by the oaks of Mamre, dwelling in a mutual defense alliance with 3 Amorite brothers, Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner. When Abram hears that his kinsman has been taken captive, his reaction is immediate. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't sit back, wring his hands, and pray for a miracle while doing nothing. He steps into his God-given vocation as a protector, a kinsman, redeemer, and the head of his clan. He understands that faith doesn't mean passivity. He arms his 318 trained men, servants born in his own household. This detail is crucial. These weren't mercenaries he hired. These were men who grew up under Abram's roof, likely learning about the true God, trained in discipline and loyalty. They were a small, faithful remnant. Now think about the odds here. Abram has 318 guys, plus a few Amorite allies, against 4 conquering imperial armies that just swept the entire region and crushed the giants. Militarily, this is suicide. It's a Gideon moment centuries before Gideon. But Abram moves with confidence, not in his numbers, but in his calling. He pursues them all the way to Dan, which is a massive distance north. Once he catches up, he employs a brilliant tactical move. He splits his forces for a night attack. In the ancient world, night attacks were terrifying because they caused confusion and panic. An army couldn't tell if they were being attacked by 300 men or 30,000. Abram routs them. He chases them almost to Damascus, well outside the promised land boundaries. He recovers everything, the loot, the women, the people, and his nephew Lot. It's a complete, total victory. It demonstrates that God works through means. He used Abram's sword, his strategy, and his trained men to deliver Lot. It proves that God is the Lord of history and battles, protecting the carrier of his promise against overwhelming odds, and showing that the gates of hell, or Babylon, cannot prevail against God's people. As Abram returns from this miraculous victory, flushed with adrenaline and success, we get one of the most mysterious and significant scenes in the entire Old Testament, starting in verse 17. He arrives at the valley of Shaveh, also known as the King's Valley, and 2 kings come out to meet him. It's a tale of 2 kings representing 2 very different kingdoms. The first to appear is the king of Sodom, likely the new king or the one who crawled out of the tar pit. But before he can say much, he is interrupted by a figure who seems to step out of eternity, Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Melchizedek is fascinating because he has no introduction, no genealogy, and no backstory in the text. His name means king of righteousness, and he rules Salem, which means peace, shalom. This city is almost certainly the ancient site of Jerusalem. We are told he is a priest of God Most High, El Elyon. This is stunning because it reveals there were still believers in the true God in Canaan, apart from Abram's family. Melchizedek brings out bread and wine to refresh Abram. As Christians, it is impossible not to see the foreshadowing here. We see a king of peace and righteousness providing a meal of bread and wine, acting as a priest, not by ancestry, like the Levites would be, but by God's appointment. It points us directly to Jesus, who offers us his body and blood in the bread and wine of the Lord's Supper. Melchizedek blesses Abram, and notice the content of the blessing. He attributes the victory entirely to God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. He centers Abram's success not on Abram's strategy, but on God's deliverance. Abram, in response, recognizes the spiritual authority of this man. He gives him a tenth of everything, a tithe. This isn't a legal requirement yet. The law of Moses hasn't been written. This is a voluntary act of worship and gratitude, a tangible confession that God is the owner of all things. It's a beautiful picture of the fellowship of believers, transcending boundaries, united in the worship of the one true Creator. The chapter closes with a stark, dramatic contrast in verses 21 through 24. After the holy encounter with Melchizedek, the king of Sodom speaks up again. He represents the way of the world. He makes a transactional deal. Give me the persons, the souls, but take the goods for yourself. By the laws of ancient warfare, Abram had a right to keep it all, the people and the property. He had won them. But Abram flatly, almost fiercely, refuses. He tells the king of Sodom that he has sworn a solemn oath to the Lord, God Most High, using the same name Melchizedek used, that he wouldn't take so much as a thread or a sandal strap from him. Why such a hard line? Because Abram understood the spiritual danger. He didn't want the king of Sodom to ever be able to say, I made Abram rich. He refused to be entangled with the wicked economy of Sodom. He knew that his blessing, his future, and his great reward were tied to God's promise, not to the spoils of a godless city. He wanted his reliance to be wholly on the Lord's grace and provision. If he took the money, he might feel beholden to Sodom. By refusing it, he remained free to serve God alone. However, Abram is also practical and just. He ensures that his allies, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, get their fair share for their labor and risk. He doesn't impose his personal conviction on them, showing he is a just leader